that a debt is not repaid unless it's publicly acknowledged. And so this opportunity for me is a very auspicious one, because I have a debt to you, dear Jeff, that dates back many decades now. You've taught me so much about how to think about democratic reason, which is the subject here today. And I just want to say a bit, if you can close your ears, about your, I said if Jeff would close his ears, I just want to say 2 or 3 things about his contributions for a long time. First, to me, they've always been marked by a combination of 3 distinct sensibilities. One is a sensibility that, to use a phrase John Rawls used in late work, of what I would call realistic utopianism. That is to imagine a better moment, a better future, as you imagined in 1980s Poland. But that was not so far away from possibility that it could not be realized. A second sensibility is a kind of a creative, imaginative pragmatism. In your very earliest work on Polish theater, you understood that these acts of creativity were acts of doing. We talked earlier about the as-if world, but a kind of stretching in your work of the meaning of pragmatics beyond, say, standard cost benefit analysis or some such thing. And finally, you've known really since your graduate student days, I think, at Chicago, that things don't always get better. Sometimes they get worse. And therefore, we are guardians of what is precious to us, politically, socially, culturally, and not just imagining the future, but also protecting the gains. And these sensibilities are particularly important right now. You know, a New School story, some of you know it, right after 1989 at Jonathan Fanton's president's house, there was a gathering of scholars and trustees, and there was a remarkable group of trustees, Vera List, Henry Arnhold, Dorothy Hirshhorn, Walter Eberstadt, Mike Gellert, you know, Arnold Aronson. You could go through a list of, and one of them, I think it was Aronson, asked me, what year is 1989 most like in European history? And without much reflection, but without any original thought, I said 1848, a great year of liberal revolution. And his immediate retort was, well, what happened in 1849? And in effect, we're in an extended 1849, in which the capacities of constitutional liberal democracies are in question. Very strikingly, just in the last 2 days, and I'll end with these sort of brief reminiscences, 2 days, I've been shaken in the following way. Yesterday, I teach weekly a class of a group of persons called Obama scholars at Columbia. I co-teach, I'm privileged to co-teach with Jack Lew, who teaches in our policy school and a former Secretary of Treasury, et cetera, et cetera. And we have the Obama scholars, a dozen of them from all around the world, Solomon Islands, Argentina, India, I could go on, and Nigeria. And we've spent the whole year talking about democratic reason, as it were. And we took the last class, or last seminar, it's not really a formal class, to go around the table to hear from each of their perspectives where we were in terms of constitutional, liberal, decent democracy. And every single one, you know, think of the recent ones from Slovenia, with the recent election of success, to Nigeria and others, said, none of us is enjoying, as it were, multi-party or two-party competition within an assumed framework of assured liberal and democratic values, rule of law, government by consent, individual and collective rights, limited government, etc. And each time we have a political moment or conflict, we are engaged in not just an episodic battle over who controls the legislature or what, but over many more, the more fundamental questions about of regime questions, as it were. And that's new. And then the night before, I was at a law school seminar, which was about, the pivot was Ernst Frankel's 1941, I think, book on the dual state, about law in Nazi Germany, in which, as many of you know, he distinguishes between normative law, which is the kind of law we like, basically, and prerogative law, in which the state does what it wants and controls. And it was a room primarily of constitutional lawyers who, almost to a person, were concerned about how here in America and in various European and other countries where you would have thought you had the most security for normative law, how it is that prerogative law is making many kinds of ugly appearances. So that's the background for my expression of debt. I just want to take 5 or 7 minutes to say what I think are the three core challenges right now, or substantive challenges of democratic reason at a moment of turbulence and growing uncertainty. And I'm guided in a way by a sentence that comes from Rousseau's Social Contract. I rarely quote Rousseau because I'm not a big fan but it reminded me, Jeff, of key works where he talked about aiming at bringing together thought so that justice and utility are in no way divided. And I think that's our challenge. And Rousseau also said that this mode of thinking was taking men, he said, people, as they are, and laws as they might be. So it's a combination of realism about humankind, but also an aspiration for arrangements, institutional and legal, in which justice and utility are in no way divided. And I think that's been one of your, as I read Goldfarb, another set of sensibilities which have directed your work. And I think substantively, we face the following 3 big challenges of thought. The first is based on reminding ourselves that there's, whereas when the United States was founded, it was incredibly revolutionary to say, here's a regime based on popular sovereignty, not on, we the people declare. Now, we understand the definition of the people was limited and constrained, but the revolutionary aspect of that statement is incontestable. Today, there's no regime on earth that doesn't think of itself as based on, or claim that it's based on popular sovereignty. North Korea is a people's republic. So the question then for us is how to create reason that crisply distinguishes different types of democracy based on the claim of popular sovereignty. And in so doing, of course, the easy answer is good democracy has rights and law and consent and representation and so on. But each of these domains is not a fixed given. Each of these domains is remarkably contested and even charged with ambiguity and often ugly possibilities. Just take the idea of political representation, which isn't just a liberal idea, it's an old Republican idea from the ancients. Political representation means that the state has to be permeable to the visions and views of members of civil society. But what if they're ugly? What if they're illiberal? They get ported through liberal mechanisms directly into the center of the state. And we have seen that recently in America, but we've seen it across American history, quite apart from other countries' history. So democratic reason, combining political thought and empirical studies of diverse kinds, must grapple with not just the distinction between the liberal and illiberal democracies, you know, Urban here and good things there, Orban there and good things there, but a deeper and richer understanding of the repertoire within the liberal tradition, and how institutionally and normatively we act to maximize the likelihood of justice and utility being joined. Second, concerns the following. What has distinguished, certainly in the 20th century, what distinguished Western liberal regimes from, say, those regimes in Moscow, Berlin, Rome, was the insistence on differentiation among and between state and property, state and society, economy and society. That is to say, the liberal world is a differentiated world. The fascist world fused state and civil society. The Bolshevik world fused property and the state. But once you separate elements, then really other hard questions begin. What are the rules of exchange and transaction that connect these differentiated realms? And we can, in ordinary times, we debate more or fewer taxes, regulate this way or that, antitrust plus or minus, and the state regulating the economy. You could go through each of these paired examples and find a normal democratic politics. But today, it seems to me more is at stake in these transactions, because the choices we make about how to connect, say, civil society and the state via mechanisms of communication in the digital age, as an example. Excuse me. The choices we make about these have implications not only for center left, center right, or which party is dominant at a time, but have fundamental implications for the basic norms and institutions of constitutional liberal democracy itself. And finally, there are three edges to even the best, the most secure, the most wonderful liberal democratic polities, three sets of issues which recur and recur and recur, and about which the liberal tradition itself doesn't have enough to say. And what do I mean by it? Think of three domains. The domain of faith, religion, where persons have not just the kind of incommensurable values sometimes that Isaiah Berlin spoke of, but a willingness to bet all on, it's an all or nothing proposition sometimes. And global history is full of fields of blood generated by religious passion. Of course, religion is also noble. Religion is, these are not bad things I'm about to say, but they contain the seeds. And second is the persisting question of membership. We don't live in a one world order, and therefore, who gets to enjoy rights, consent, representation, rule of law, etc. These are questions both of external to internal immigration, but also questions about full citizenship inside a polity. And finally, there's the question that brings us back to prerogative powers, the question of national security. Liberal democracies are all state-centered. They presume a world of states. Well, a world of states, as we see on a daily basis, is a world of physical insecurity. it's Locke, of course, who famously said in writing about prerogative powers that executives must at times be free to act not only outside the law, but against the law. Hamilton in Federalist Papers writes how in matters of national exigency, meaning security, there shall be no constitutional shackles. Well, we could talk for hours about this, but it's a form of prerogative power, which I think in a wholly unoriginal way is impossible to elide. And any regime that fails in the security dimension is a profoundly failed order. So the question then is, how can a liberal democracy best manage questions of security? So I'll end with this. I think these are questions. And what is so striking finally, is as I hear and read and have learned from Jeff over the years, what I've discovered is that the imaginative, the cultural, the memory, the dimensions that I know I ordinarily don't put front and center as opposed to big political structures or so on, are zones without which, if we pay no attention to them, we can't answer any of these questions and effectively pursue democratic reason. So thank you, dear Jeff.